Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited for this event titled the Puente Plática. We have some extra special guest speakers here for you. So in a moment, I'm going to read my introductions. But first, we have our introductions here that I would like to give. My name is Anthony Gonzalez. Students know me as Mr. G. I teach English here at DVC, and I am proud to be a co-coordinator of the Puente project and a member of the Dreamers Alliance. This event is a Puente-sponsored event and a Dreamers collaboration. This is part of the Undocumented Student Week of Action, and this is part of our curriculum for our Puente students. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask the Puente team and one of the tri-chairs of the Dreamers Alliance to introduce themselves. We have some student speakers for you. Very excited to hear from them, and then I'll introduce our guest speakers.
Buenos días a todos. Good morning. My name is Maria Dorado, and I am one of the Puente counselors and one of the Puente co-coordinators.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brenda Gonzalez. I'm also a Puente counselor and co-coordinator.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick Leong, English instructor in the Puente project with Brenda as my partner here. And again, thank you for being here for this very important topic as we support those coming to the United States looking for new opportunities and new lives for themselves. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brianne Guerra, and I am the program assistant for the DVC project. And I just, again, want to chime off of my team. We're so very happy that you're all here to experience this with our wonderful guest speakers, and we hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Gomez. I am serving as a counseling intern with the Puente team this year and also work to administratively support them. I'm also a member of the Dreamers Alliance.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Professor Albert Ponce. I teach in political science, and I'm very proud to work with this team of committed colleagues, scholars, activists, and I link up my Latinx politics and American government, Poli-Sci 122. And it's great to see you all come and listen to experts on this matter and make sense of what's happening in our world and how we can work to really serve humanity in a way where all are equal and work to abolish walls and borders everywhere from the southern US border to Palestine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Juan Huerta. I'm a professor here under early childhood education. I'm also one of the tri-chairs of the Dreamers Alliance here in campus. We're so excited to overlap with our population, the Puente population, because our students are everywhere in our community and here in campus. So we're very excited to be here. Just as a quick reminder, tomorrow we have another Undocu Week event. A speaker, Florsario, will be talking here at the Diablo Room from 1 to 2:30 p.m. about pursuing higher education. And on Friday, we have a student panel from our own DVC students and former DVC students who are in their quest of completing higher education. So please join us tomorrow and Friday.
Thank you so much. Shout out to the Puente team and the Dreamers Alliance. Before we introduce our special guest speakers, I wanted to hear from a couple of students. So shout out to our Cycle 29 Puentistas. We've asked a couple of students to share a little bit about their experiences learning about this really important topic. So with that, I want to give a special thanks and shout out. Let's hear it for Jesus Orozco.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesus Orozco. I am a Cycle 29 Puentista, and my major is Allied Health. By reading the book Solito by Javier Zamora, I realized that people do not migrate from their countries because they want to. Which is the case of Javier Zamora parents who, due to the wars and the economic crisis in El Salvador, had to migrate to the United States. Javier Zamora, like many children, started his journey at the age of 9 years old. He made it to the United States and he finally reunited with his parents. But not all the children's stories end well, like Javier's story. Such is the case of a Salvadorian girl who at the age of 8 years old crossed the border, but before reaching the border of the Mexican border, she was sexually abused by her coyote. When we hear the word migration, we can imagine people having an adventure or a trip, but the reality is different. In my own words, migration means hope, dream, or as some people call it, el sueño americano. Javier Zamora started his book by saying, trip. My parents started using the word about 1 year ago. One day you will take a trip to be with us. This is how many stories begin of children migrating from their countries to be with their parents. For a better for a better future. The significance of reading more about Latinos, it's to learn and understand how difficult it's to migrate from your country to another country. To migrate from your country to another country, and that will make us more sensitive to other Latinos, and we finally gonna understand that Latinos don't come to this country just because they want to have a higher education, but they come to this country because in their countries they are not resources, educational resources, or food or money to survive. They come to this country because they want a better life, they want a better future for their children, and they want to make history as Javier Zamora. Thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Jesus. Appreciate those thoughtful words. Next, I would like to invite another student speaker. So please give it up for Katie Perdomo.
Hi, my name is Katie Perdomo. I am in Cycle 29. I am in Mr. G's and Maria's class. The book Solito by Javier Zamora taught me and exposed me to the journey of a child leaving his home country to the United States to reunite with his family. Solito gave me the insight of a child's experience migrating as a 9-year-old, and it reminded me of my mother's experience, who came with me as a 8-month-old. They both share the similarity of relying on others. Javier traveling with people who became his new family, and my mother traveling with a little human that probably made it much harder for her journey. Reading Solito, I realized my understanding of the process of migrating to the US. It gave me the perspective and more understanding of the process of migrating. Oh. It gave me the new perspective and a new understanding and appreciation towards my mom's sacrifice in leaving her home. I realized the struggle and courage she had when traveling with me in her arms, opening various reasons as why people migrate, whether it's reuniting with family or fleeing from horrible situations such as war or gangs. When reading Solito, I read an interview with Adrian Cruz, and he shares his choice of leaving his home country, basically forced to leave because of the violence he had to endure. Taking into account various points of views like my mother's, Javier's, and Adrian's stories, I was given a clear view of stories and their shared feelings of guilt and isolation. The topic of migration is interesting and important because as a person of Salvadorian descent, it's something that resonates with my family, who decided to leave their entire lives to migrate to a state they knew nothing about. A sacrifice that changes their lives, isolated them from people they once knew, and distanced them from their traditional roots. Today, as our guests are here, I'm glad they're willing to share their experience with us, an opportunity to become more aware of migration and its effects on family and the youth.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you to our wonderful student speakers. I know it's not easy to do that, but your insights share the reason why it is so important to have our valued guests here and to discuss this topic. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Leisy Abrego. Dr. Leisy Abrego is a professor in Chicana and Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. She is a member of the first large wave of Salvadoran immigrants who arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1980s. Her research and teaching interests, inspired in great part by her own family's experiences, are in Central American immigration, Latino families, the inequalities created by gender, and the production of illegality through US immigration laws. And that word illegality is in quotation marks. Her award-winning first book, Sacrificing Families, Navigating Laws, Labor, and Love Across Borders, examines the well-being of Salvadoran immigrants and their families, both in the US and in El Salvador, as these are shaped by immigration policies and gendered expectations. Her early research examines how immigration and educational policies shape the educational trajectories of undocumented students. Her second book, Immigrant Families, is co-authored with Cecilia Menjivar and Leah Schmalzbauer and delves deeply into the structural conditions contextualizing the diverse experiences of contemporary immigrant families in the United States. More recently, Dr. Abrego has been writing about how different subsectors of Latino immigrants internalize immigration policies differently, and how this shapes their willingness to make claims in the United States. Her current project examines the day-to-day lives of mixed status families after DACA. Her scholarship analyzing legal consciousness, illegality, and legal violence has garnered numerous national awards. She also dedicates much of her time to supporting and advocating for refugees and immigrants by writing expert declarations in asylum cases, and I think that deserves a round of applause. So please give it up for Dr. Leisy Abrego.
Thank you all so much for being here. Let me move this. So I was told that I'd have about 15 minutes, and I thought I'd use this time as a bit of a continuation from the conversation we were having earlier. Let me see. I wanted you to see. Okay. So just to get started, I'll say I am Salvadoreña. I was born in El Salvador. I came at the age of 5. I grew up all this time. I've lived in LA. And it's from those experience of being an immigrant, of being a member of an immigrant family, of being involved in community organizations and spaces that I care about these things. I care about understanding why my family was here, why the people around me, so many of my own students continue to have to leave their countries. And so a lot of my work is about trying to figure that out, how people make sense of it, how people have been forced into certain trajectories. And so reminder from last talk that Central Americans have a long history with the US of US intervention there, right, since the late 1800s at least. But migration to the US didn't really start until the mid 70s and then really shot up in the 80s. And I want you to understand how US presidents express themselves about Central Americans. And so here's a clip from Ronald Reagan in 1984 when he's trying to convince Congress to give him more billions of dollars to send to the region to arm and train the soldiers there who were committing human rights abuses. I don't know if there's, it's okay.
Central America is America. It's at our doorstep, and it's become the stage for a bold attempt by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua to install communism by force throughout the hemisphere. When half of our shipping tonnage and imported oil passes through Caribbean shipping lanes, and nearly half of all our foreign trade passes through the Panama Canal and Caribbean waters, America's economy and well-being are at stake. Right now in El Salvador, Cuban-supported aggression has forced more than 400,000 men, women, and children to flee their homes. And in all of Central America, more than 800,000 have fled, many, if not most, living in unbelievable hardship. Concerns about the prospect of hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing communist oppression to seek entry into our country are well-founded. What we see in El Salvador is an attempt to destabilize the entire region and eventually move chaos and anarchy toward the American border.
So there's a lot in that. I don't know how well you were able to hear it, but basically he's talking about crisis. This region is in crisis. The people themselves are dealing with communist subversion and really trying to destabilize the whole region, he says. They're spreading chaos and anarchy and bringing it to our borders. He says that, right? This is the only time people were going to hear about Central Americans in the US. They didn't understand how deeply involved their government, their military was in the region, and this is how they're being represented. And so when people are coming, the US denies them access to legal status. Most of them had to come undocumented, even though they were protected by international law to apply for refugee or asylum status. And so the majority end up being undocumented. Today, there are about 4 million Central Americans from this region of 7 countries living in the US. These numbers are likely on the conservative side because so many people are undocumented and we can't count them officially. But of those groups, particularly from Honduras, from Guatemala, and El Salvador, about half are undocumented or have only a temporary protection that doesn't give them long-term stability in this country. So I study immigration then. I study immigration policies and how they play out in people's lives. And you would think that that would be an easy thing because laws are written, you can read them, you can supposedly understand what they're doing, but immigration law in the US in practice is really messy. It's very inconsistently enforced. So even if you look on paper at 2 cases of 2 people that look very similar, their outcomes might be really different. There are federal laws. Those are the laws that determine who's allowed to come in and who gets kicked out of the country. But every state and every municipality even gets to make some decisions about what resources are available to immigrants. And so, for example, California is generally known as a immigrant-friendly state because they allow undocumented students to access in-state tuition in colleges, right? Or they allow immigrants to access some healthcare benefits. Like these kinds of things are not the case everywhere. Each state decides for themselves what is and isn't possible. And sometimes each city decides that they want to be a sanctuary city or they want to do the opposite of that. And so for immigrants to figure out what they can access and what they can't is like a constantly changing thing that makes it really confusing. There's also within immigration law something called discretion that is written into it, meaning that the police officer that stops you for a broken taillight, that police officer has the discretion by law to decide in that moment if they're going to take this person into deportation proceedings or if they're going to let you go. Right? That they have that power, the law gives it to them. Judges have that power when people are in front of them to decide, I'm going to give this person another chance or this is it, I'm kicking them out, right? So there's a lot of discretion. The other layer of this is that we're talking about human beings. There are still laws in place that protect you as human beings, that protect you as workers, as students, as renters, as children. Even if at the federal level, you're legally not supposed to be here, you still have these rights. And so being able to navigate all of that can be really challenging depending on where you are. All of that, plus what we see in the media, the way that people talk about immigrants, the way they use certain words and images on the news when referring to immigrants, all of that produces what it means to be undocumented in this moment. There's nothing inherent in a human being that makes them undocumented or quote unquote illegal. That's not how it works. But these laws and the images and the words that we hear and the way people are treated, all of that tells us to be undocumented right now means that you are having to deal with these really difficult cumulative long-term effects of the law. So to get at those effects, sociologist Cecilia Menjivar and I, she's also Salvadoran, we looked at our interviews that we had done in different places and really started to explore how the effects of this, we can call that violence. It's not just, you know, bad luck or anything like that. It feels like violence. So there's different ways to think about violence. The ways that we're usually taught are about what you see, where one person is hitting another and someone gets a bruise or there's blood. You can point it out, you can say this is wrong. And we think that that kind of physical violence is the only violence that exists, but we can also think about another form of violence that is structural. And what I mean by structural violence is that all of, oh, this didn't show up very well up there, sorry about that. All of the institutions that govern your life, so education, the labor market, the healthcare system, the electoral system, right? All of these systems that have their own rules and you have to go through them and you don't have a choice to really be outside of them very much. Those systems are set up so that there are always going to be winners and losers. Those systems are set up in such a way that there's no way that everyone is going to do well. Even if you are the top student in some high schools in this state, you did not have the resources, you did not have the new books, you didn't have the stable teacher who was present throughout the year, you didn't have the access to AP courses that would have allowed you to get into the top colleges, right? That, the fact that the system is built that way means that that is structural violence. There will be people who, no matter how great they are as workers, as a domestic worker, even if you're the best domestic worker, there's no structure for you to move up and do better and gain access to economic stability, right? And so we're told it's all about meritocracy, it's all about how hard you work. But the reality is that the system is not set up for everyone to do well. And that when you have the people who can't even access enough money to pay their rent and healthcare and bills, that have to stress about that every month, that some people argue is a form of slow death, to constantly be worried about having access to the things that you need for day-to-day life. That is structural violence. It's produced by those systems. Another form of violence, oh, there you can see it better. Symbolic violence is the kind of violence that we all participate in because we see the inequalities, but instead of blaming the system, we blame ourselves, we blame the people who didn't do well, and we assume that the people who are doing well, it's because they actually worked hard enough. And the reality is that that's not true, right? Structural violence has already laid out those unequal outcomes. But with symbolic violence, we internalize it and we blame ourselves for not getting into the right school, for not getting a job that pays us enough. We blame those communities like, oh, their parents probably don't care about education. That's why so few are going to college. No, the systems are set up that way, but we participate and we don't try to change it because then we blame the people. And that's symbolic violence. So our argument is that the law, immigration law, makes these things not only possible, but likely for immigrants. Violence ends up being an automatic result that's made possible when you implement this law with all its discretion and all of that. And so harming people becomes not only normal, but acceptable. So it was interesting to see that moment during the Trump administration when we were hearing the voices of children crying, being detained, and all of a sudden it felt like, wait, this is not normal. This is not acceptable. We need to do something about it. Campaigns about families belong together, you know, all of that. But this kind of harm has been going on long before and continues after the Trump administration. And so we're all again participating in the symbolic violence of it all, because if we hear about people being detained, we think, oh, they must have done something to deserve that. So I mentioned in the previous talk, in 2014 is when the news was flooded with all these images of children in these detention centers, sleeping on the floor, all of that, that forced then President Obama to talk about Central Americans. They were the majority of those kids, having to deal with this crisis of criminality that they were facing on their journey north. They were a kind of crisis, a humanitarian crisis. So again, really playing up this idea, like Reagan, that crisis is what we associate with the people from this region. And so what he used in response, he decided to expand the US border into Mexico in a sense. He decided to fund Mexican police, Mexican migration authorities to expand and not allow people to get all the way into the US because he didn't want those images to make him look bad on the news every night. He also used this moment to expand this idea of the border, the way that there's no protections in detention, expand family detention centers around the country. So much so that in a span of just 6 months, from July to December 2014, there was a huge expansion of the number of detention centers, like 200%, something like that. I'm forgetting the actual percentage, but it was ridiculous how quickly they mobilized to create detention spaces for mothers and children. And all of it was using this rhetoric of, we're just trying to keep people from coming. We want them to understand things are not going to go well, and this is the message we want to send to them. With the money that they sent to Mexico immediately, we saw within a 3-year span that adults who were being detained in Mexico, Central Americans, went from 80,000 to almost double that within just 3 years. And for children, the unaccompanied children, like Javier Zamora in the book that many of you have read, right? In a span of 3 years with the US funding that was sent, that multiplied 10 times over how many children they were detaining and deporting from Mexico, effectively having expanded the US border. Within the US, like I mentioned, it was these detention centers. Oh, and here it is, 35 times over. In fewer than 6 months, they expanded the spaces for these families in what effectively are prison cells. They, in some cases, they used actual prisons that were empty and they just threw in a crib, and then they called it Family Residential Center. But you can tell, right? Obviously, they were treating people like inmates for a right that they have, an international human right to seek a place of safety. So I'll share just a few quotes. It took a lot of time to gather the information. In this case, it was the ACLU and the University of Chicago that applied for a FOIA request to get any data that they had on children reporting harm done to them at the Border Patrol spaces. It took a long time, so Obama was no longer president, but all of this happened during the Obama administration. And I won't go through it in detail because it's hard to read, but just know that children were being subjected to forms of sexual violence. Children were being subjected to fear, extreme fear tactics. They were completely unprotected. This FOIA request produced 30,000 pages of documents of children complaining about what was done to them in those detention centers. All of that happened under the Obama administration. And at that time, very few people were calling this out and protesting. By 2018, you can see here, the number was actually much smaller, but Trump used it and talked about it as if it were much bigger than ever before. And having already set up Central Americans as these criminals, these like animalistic kinds of people, he set out particularly against Central Americans in his policies. So the very first interview he gave after he was elected president, before he actually took the presidency, he was interviewed for Time magazine, and the reporter asked him, "What are you going to do about immigration?" And he's in his home and he pulls out this, not even a real newspaper, a tabloid that focused on a really heinous crime that a gang member had committed in New York. And in his response about what he was going to do about immigration, he said, "They come from Central America. They're tougher than any people you've ever met. They're killing and raping everybody out there. They're illegal and they are finished." So he named Central Americans in particular. In several of his speeches for all of his executive orders, for example, he talked about, "We're in the middle of this crisis on our southern border. The unprecedented surge of illegal immigrants from Central America is harming both Mexico and the United States." He used over and over and over this trope of Central Americans and Salvadorans in particular as being these heinous gang members, dehumanized in so many ways that he couldn't even say like undocumented children. His phrase was always illegal, unaccompanied alien minors. He found ways to use language to dehumanize Central Americans, even children, so much that eventually he was able to get enough people who support him to look the other way when he passed this zero tolerance border policy that in effect separated every child coming with an adult. Every adult, even if they legally had the right to apply for asylum, was processed through ICE, and parents were separated from children in at least 2,700 cases. We've heard much more than that at this point. Children were then labeled as unaccompanied and sent through another agency, and there was never any centralized system to keep track of people to help them find each other after this process. So some people were able to do that, and for some people, it took years to find each other again. There were these images for a little while where you couldn't dehumanize children as fully. But if you see this image from June 2018, the little girl here, she's from Honduras and she was with her mother who was being searched. We can focus on the girl. A lot of different sources started publishing that image, but each time like focusing only on the girl and her crying. And then eventually this really iconic time cover where the mom is completely taken out of the picture. We can only have a sense of empathy, compassion for the little girl because we've dehumanized Central Americans so much that as adults, we really we can't care about them. So Central America, so often portrayed as crisis, really always manages to erase the role of the US in that process, what it has done to force people out, why so many have had to flee in recent years in caravans to try to stay safe because of everything that happens, how it has fueled hate across borders, where Mexicans then also started repeating the same kinds of things that Trump supporters here would say against immigrants, and changing the laws and going against international human rights law in such ways that people were prevented from even applying for asylum. All of that is legal violence. And we saw it more clearly under the Trump administration. But I want to encourage you to think beyond one party about when harm is being caused, how it's being produced, what are the long-term effects for those people. And I don't want to leave you only with that. I don't want you to think that this is all happening to people, and people just kind of sit and take it. People organize, people fight back in so many different ways. And it's important to look for those as well. This is a picture from the first organized sort of public welcome that we did in LA for children who were being sent back. Busloads of children were being brought to a place in Southern California, and people blocked those buses, not allowing the children in. And so we held this, mostly made up of Central American immigrants who came in the 1980s, there to support those who are continuing to come. Resistance happens in all kinds of ways, from scholars and various activists coming together to demand legal protections and to be able to sue the government for what it's done to different populations. But also people fight back in Central America. We never hear that story. This is very much the case. Here's an example in 2006 in El Salvador, before the Central American Free Trade Agreement was signed. They were demanding that their government not sign on to that because they knew what was coming. They knew how much worse things were going to get. And they organized and showed up and risked their lives to do that. Same thing under the previous administration in Honduras. Juan Orlando Hernandez was actually, he's now in prison for being a drug trafficker, but people organized, risking their lives because it's very much a militarized society right now, knowing that this person is very much put in place by the United States because it does its dirty work of always choosing profits over people. And so you'll hear on the news, you'll hear the way people talk about immigrants and say, why don't they stay and fight in their country? Why don't they improve their country? Why don't they get in the back of the line? All these things that in reality make no sense. People are doing exactly that. And it is in large part, not only this government, but in large part this government that produces the conditions that force people to leave their countries. So I will leave it there. I'm really excited to hear about how this shows up for you, what questions you have a conversation around that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abrego. And with that, I would like to introduce our next guest speaker. Dr. Raul Moreno Campos was born in San Salvador, El Salvador, and lived there throughout the duration of the Salvadorian civil conflict from 1980 to 1992. He settled in Los Angeles and attended public schools in the East San Fernando Valley. Moreno Campos holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, where he has taught courses on race and politics in Latin America, Afro-American political thought, and interracial dynamics in US society and culture. Prior to attending graduate school, Moreno Campos worked for MALDEF's education department on projects related to equal access to education and empowerment in Latino communities. His fields of expertise include Afro-American and Latin American political thought, Marxism, race relations in the United States, 20th century Latin American cultural and intellectual history, the politics of authoritarian regimes, and state-sponsored violence in the Americas. Moreno Campos is currently a lecturer in Chicana and Chicano studies at CSU Channel Islands. So let's give it up for Dr. Moreno Campos.
Good afternoon, folks. Testing, testing. Okay, just making sure. All right, folks. I've been noticing a lot of the student success strategies that Mr. G's been talking about. Really impressed. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And what I intend to do in this presentation is to fill in some of the historical material here to understand the narrative of not only Salvadorian history, but also the historical presence of Salvadorians here in the United States. Let me begin by saying that it is an honor for me to be here today to deliver this talk, because this is indeed a historic occasion. And it is historic because our meeting here today was in part catalyzed by the singular accomplishment of Javier Zamora, who is the first Salvadorian poet, and I should say Salvadorian American poet, to pen his story of migration to the United States and to give us an account of that migration from the perspective of a child. And such an accomplishment makes this occasion historic indeed, because for most of us Central Americans, we do not get to tell our stories. Okay. So as a first generation Salvadorian immigrant and scholar myself, who migrated to the US as a child in December of 1991, 1 month before the conclusion of the Salvadorian Civil War, it is personally important for me to be here today to share this information with you and my story with you. Because as I mentioned, the stories of the vast majority of Central Americans in the US are unknown, just as the reasons for their migrations and the conditions that catalyze them remain an enigma for most people in this country. And despite this, and yet, there's a whole series of unexamined and widely held beliefs about Central Americans and Salvadorians in particular, and they abound in the United States. And figuring prominently amongst these beliefs is the notion that El Salvador is an insignificant country and its people equally insignificant and expendable. So for example, I'd like to share with you an incident that took place in the White House in January 11th of 2018, okay? A bipartisan group of US senators on this date met in the Oval Office to discuss the future of temporary protected status, or TPS. This was enacted after the US Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1990 and signed into law by George H.W. Bush. TPS is a program that since then has been utilized by the US government to provide migrants fleeing natural disasters and political violence with temporary permission to remain in the United States. El Salvador became a principal designee of TPS since the program's inception in 1990. Having few legal recourses to remain in the US with authorization, since 97% of Salvadorian political asylum cases were denied by the US government during the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians have applied to this program since its launch, including my father in the early 1990s. So at this meeting at the Oval Office, Donald Trump asked, quote, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here?" Unquote. Okay. Trump's statement illustrates the unexamined beliefs that I was talking about earlier. The racism that holds El Salvador in the public imagination in this country as a deplorable wasteland, and its people as backward and as expendable. But Trump's comment also reveals a profound ignorance of Salvadorian history as an inextricable part of American history, and an ignorance of the reasons for the historical presence of Salvadorians in the United States. The Salvadorian population that we are talking about here exceeds 2.5 million people. These are Salvadorians in the US, making it the third largest Latino group by nationality after Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. This makes Salvadorians nearly 4% of the 63.7 million Latinos in the US. Between 2000 and 2021, the Salvadorian population in this country grew by 250%. And contrary to common misconceptions, nearly 70% or 1.7 million of all Salvadorians here are US born or are naturalized US citizens. Now, as are, and I should say this, 77% of all US Latinos, that's a supermajority, folks. This is contrary to common misconceptions. And the remaining 750,000 Salvadorians that are not US citizens, 350,000 are permanent residents, while 180,000 hold TPS and 22,600 Salvadorian youth had DACA status in 2022. Now, according to the demographic projections of the US Census Bureau, by 2050, 1 in 3 Americans will trace their origins to Latin America. And given the demographic patterns I've just detailed, Salvadorians are poised to be a significant proportion of the over 120 million Latinos that will be 33% of this nation's population 3 decades from now. That's your lifetime, in your lifetime. Maybe not mine, we'll see. It is important, therefore, to retrace the history of why Salvadorians are present in the United States and to ask what role the US played in the process of Salvadorian migration, and also to understand why these processes are crucial to both present and the future of this nation. These are the facts. The Salvadorian presence in the US is a direct result of the US government's intervention in the domestic affairs of El Salvador over the last 130 years. In particular, the military and economic policies that the US pursued in El Salvador since the Reagan administration led to a 2,800% increase in the Salvadorian population in the United States since 1980. Principal amongst these reasons is the US support of the brutal Salvadorian military regime during the Salvadorian Civil War, a regime which the US knew routinely abused human rights, and the direct training and financing of the Salvadorian military to the tune of $1 million per day, or $3.5 million dollars per day in today's dollars, led ultimately to the deaths of 100,000 Salvadorians, 80% of whom were innocent civilians. And as detailed in the United Nations report on the Salvadorian Civil War, which Professor Abrego spoke about earlier, 85% of civilians perished at the hands of the military regime. The incalculable human suffering of this war waged against the Salvadorian people resulted in the forced dislocation of 20% of the nation's population over the 12-year Civil War. And in the post-war period, Bill Clinton's Immigration Act led to the mass deportation of Salvadorians, many of whom were the sons and daughters of those who fled during the Civil War. deepening the poverty, the violence, and instability in El Salvador. Now, this is in part due to the fact that many of them took back to El Salvador the gang culture of 1980s and 1990s Los Angeles, 8 years after Clinton signed this into law. Clinton's successor, George W. Bush, signed into law the Central American Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, which led to the proliferation of sweatshops contracted by US corporations across Central America. CAFTA allowed US corporations to exploit the low cost of Salvadorian labor, whose sweatshops paid women working in these zones less than $1 per hour of arduous work, deepening the economic crisis that fueled the forced exile of hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians, a process which remains unabated today. So in this talk, I will sketch out this story, which is the story of Salvadorians in the US. But to tell the story of Salvadorians, we have to begin by telling the story of the land itself. Now, this is one of my favorite artists, Fernando Yort. We'll talk about him at the end. And in this painting, he tried to capture many of the things that were characteristically Salvadorian. Now, as you saw earlier, El Salvador is a small country. It is situated in the Central American Isthmus, the natural land bridge created by the coalescence of an archipelago of volcanic islands 4 million years ago. As a natural land bridge, El Salvador and Central America have played an important part in the natural and the human history of the American continent, for they have facilitated the dispersal of plant and animal species for the last 3 million years, and also facilitated the migrations of people for the last 10,000 years. Far from being a deplorable wasteland, or in Trump's war, a shithole, El Salvador is a tropical mountainous country gifted with black volcanic soil and black sand beaches that hug the deep blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. And as I mentioned earlier, in the Nahuatl language of my ancestors, El Salvador was known as Cuscatlan, or the land of precious things. The country itself covers an area of only 21,000 square kilometers. That's the size, folks, of the state of Massachusetts. And yet, El Salvador has over 23 volcanoes, okay, and 5 volcanic fields, making 90% of its soil derived from volcanic materials. Now, this tectonic and volcanic activity is what accounts for the great fertility of its land, since volcanic deposits create some of the most fertile soils on the planet once they weather. Now, this natural history is inextricably intertwined with the political and social history of the country, because El Salvador's historical trajectory is tied to its biggest resources, its land and its people. But aside from the tectonic forces that shape the land, man-made forces also shape the course of its history. And there's 2 man-made forces to speak about here, and that is namely Spanish colonialism and US imperialism. The colonization of El Salvador and the Central American region in the early 16th century by the Spanish Empire established enduring patterns of racial and class domination in the country. An exemplary of this domination was the subjection of indigenous Salvadorians by the Spanish colonial order and the yoke of tributary and forced labor systems. The most prominent of these labor systems, the hacienda system, endures into the contemporary period. And as a planting colony that produced indigo, cotton, sugar, and tobacco for the Spanish crown, El Salvador emerged impoverished after 300 years of Spanish colonization, like did most states in the Americas and most post-colonial societies in the early 19th century, when these countries were declaring, former colonies were declaring their independence. But independence from Spanish rule in 1821, however, did not fundamentally change the patterns of labor exploitation established during the colonial era. Embracing its identity as an agrarian republic, El Salvador's oligarchic elite turned to the cultivation of a plant not native to El Salvador. They turned to the cultivation of coffee in the late 1880s and 1890s to modernize the country. This is a plant native to Africa and introduced to the Caribbean by the French in the 1700s. Now, coffee became El Salvador's principal export and built the favored wealth of the descendants of European immigrants who came to El Salvador seeking fortune in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And for example, James Hill, born in the slums of Manchester, England, arrived in El Salvador in 1889, and by 1920, had built a global empire that made him one of the great coffee barons of the American continent, based on these berries. I should say, folks, that this is the most consumed drug in the world, okay? And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars per year in business, okay? But the establishment of James Hill's empire, like that of other oligarchs, depended on the expropriation of communal lands of indigenous Salvadorians in the 1880s and 1890s, and the consequent exploitation of agricultural workers. The expropriation of communal lands turned most indigenous Salvadorians into landless peasants who sought work in sprawling coffee estates, some of which exceeded 80,000 acres, or approximately 125 square miles as a single coffee plantation, okay? Approximately 30 years after the expropriation of communal lands, coffee became the center of the Salvadorian economy. And by 1920, for example, coffee amounted to 90% of Salvadorian exports. As the coffee economy grew, wealth became concentrated in the hands of a few. And by 1970, 4% of landowners in El Salvador held 70% of all arable land. This is a postcard of San Salvador circa 1914, showing, for example, the great prosperity of its capital city, that is the National Palace, okay? And this contrasted, of course, with the widespread poverty that you had in the coffee growing regions in the countryside. Now, as I was mentioning, by 1970, 4% of landowners in El Salvador held 70% of all arable land. And during the same period, 8% of families owned 51% of the country's GDP. Within this 8%, a mere 30 families owned the vast majority of the country's wealth. So evidently, the coffee economy did not benefit common Salvadorians who labor in the coffee plantations, while families like the Hills held immense coffee estate. Coffee pickers worked in conditions akin to slavery. And the exploitation of by Salvadorians by the coffee elite was exemplified by the Hacienda token system. Now, this is a system in which peasant workers in coffee estates were paid in worthless tokens made out of brass that could only be redeemed in the plantation stores in the coffee estates. So folks weren't even being paid with legal tender, they were being paid with brass, that could only be redeemed at these plantation stores. So by the 1950s, approximately 2 decades after the abolition of the token system, most Salvadorian workers were paid the equivalent of 33 cents per day, nearly 5 times less than the minimum income required for daily subsistence in 1950s El Salvador. And today, folks, agricultural workers in El Salvador are the poorest of all workers, earning approximately $8 per day of work, or around $241 per month. Now, amidst the widespread and abject poverty of most Salvadorians, U.S. companies, banks, and financiers profited from the Salvadorian coffee economy since the early 19th century. So for example, in January of 1882, the New York Coffee Exchange opened its doors in New York City. And in time, the US became the primary consumer of Salvadorian coffee. The United Fruit Company turned Central America into the center of its dark empire since the early 1900s. amassing vast tracts of land and pioneering the vertical integration and tax evasion strategies of modern multinational companies, United Fruit built an empire based on the cultivation and export of bananas, and an empire which depended upon the exploitation of Central American laborers and its natural resources. For example, in El Salvador, United Fruit owns 65%, in Guatemala, United Fruit owned 65% of all arable land by the middle of the 20th century. And in El Salvador, United Fruit owned 47% of the shares of the International Railways of America, a company which monopolized the Salvadorian railway system for nearly 100 years. And this was contractually written into the creation of that railway. That means El Salvador didn't take ownership of its own railroads until the 1970s, folks. And the insatiable appetite for coffee in post-Civil War United States, the period here that we're talking about leading into the early 20th century, and ever since impelled the expansion of El Salvador's coffee economy. Now, the crisis catalyzed by the Great Depression ultimately led to the establishment of the Salvadorian military dictatorship in 1932, after a revolt of indigenous peasants and urban workers was brutally crushed by the Salvadorian military, an event which the Salvadorian military used to consolidate power. In this slide, you see some of the most famous Central American revolutionaries of the 1930s, including Farabundo Martí, seated here, and Cesar Augusto Sandino, standing. Now, Farabundo Martí was a labor organizer and revolutionary in El Salvador. Cesar Augusto Sandino is the fabled Latin American revolutionary who resisted both United Fruit and the encroachment of US Marines in Nicaragua in the late 20s and early 30s, and after whom the Sandinistas named themselves in the 1970s. Now, this military regime remained in power for 5 decades, making it the longest continuous military dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere. And these are some of the historical photographs that still survive from 1932. In this particular case, an indigenous peasant leader named Anastasio Aquino, who was lynched shortly after he was captured in the 1932 revolt, as well as the vast amount of people that were killed. Some historians estimate, we'll never know the true number, but estimate that over 10,000, as much as 20, killed in a period of only 7 days and put in common graves such as that one. And the man responsible for the establishment of that military regime was General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, who remained as dictator of El Salvador until the 40s. The regime that he established, though, remained in power until the 1980s. And by the 1970s, the patterns of wealth concentration in El Salvador intensified. Salvadorian revolutionaries again waged an armed struggle against the military regime. Now, in the context of the Cold War, the Reagan administration declared through then Secretary of State Alexander Haig that it, quote, would draw a line on communist expansion in El Salvador, unquote. So this resulted in the US government of sending US Special Forces to El Salvador in 1981. At the head of these special forces, then Colonel, he retired as Brigade General, Joseph S. Stringham, US Rangers, who became the leader of the military group in El Salvador in 1981. US military advisors provided material, training, and advice, including full spectrum military training, emphasizing counterinsurgency, small unit tactics, military intelligence, and psychological warfare. Massacres after Brigade General Joseph Stringham, the next in command was Colonel James Steele. And he arrived in El Salvador in 1984, One of the things to know about Colonel James Steele is that he was later brought out of retirement. This is a little tangent, by Donald Rumsfeld when he was Secretary of State under the George W. Bush administration to wage the counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq, which the US government officially named the Salvadorian option. So this, we're talking about 2005, folks, when James Steele was in Iraq, in 1984, when he was in El Salvador as leader of the military group. So this is another interstice here. Massacres, targeted assassinations, and torture were all disappearances were all tactics utilized by the US trained Salvadorian military, which during this period of time was making headlines, as one of the best equipped and trained militaries of the Americas, in part because they had been trained by US Special Forces. Now, infamous amongst these atrocities, were the assassination of Catholic priests, and especially heinous was the assassination of the highest priest in the land, Archbishop Oscar Arnulfo Romero, while he officiated mass. Okay, in fact, accounts state that it was precisely at the moment where Monsignor Romero was consecrating the Eucharist that the sniper bullet that took his life, passed through his heart. But the killing of priests continued, and on the night of November 16, 1989, 6 Jesuit priests who were professors and public intellectuals at the prestigious Central American University were brutally assassinated by commanders belonging to an elite US-trained counterinsurgency battalion. But this counterinsurgency battalion that carried out these assassinations, and of the 6 Jesuit priests on November 16 of 1989 were also responsible for other atrocities during the war, which included, for instance, the targeting of Catholic and lay workers, that were working with poor people, such as the Moreno sisters that were raped and assassinated, by US trained troops on December 2nd of 1980. In addition to this, the types of sites that were common in El Salvador during the period of the war, showing the signs, the telltale signs, of torture and also interrogations, done by US trained military officers. In this particular case, that telltale sign is the thumbs tied together, in the back of both of these victims. And as you can see, 2 young women, okay? To leave the bodies in display was part of the tactics of psychological warfare that US trained Salvadorian military members had learned, from the US military. But in addition to these assassinations, the same battalion that was responsible for the killing of the Jesuit priests in 1989 conducted the massacre of whole villages like El Mozote in December of 1981. Part of a scorched earth campaign learned from US military advisors who conducted similar operations in Vietnam. Ultimately, by the way, James Steele was a military officer in Vietnam under the command of George Patton Jr. Okay, and he conducted, as part of the Phoenix program, similar kinds of interrogations as well as scorched earth campaigns. Ultimately, the bloodshed of the war amounted to over 100,000 dead Salvadorians and over 1 million displaced, which amounted to 20% of the nation's population. That would be, folks, the equivalent of 70 million people in this country were displaced by war. Tragically, the conclusion of the Salvadorian Civil War only saw the escalation of political violence and the rise of street gangs as a result of Bill Clinton's tough on immigration policies. Clinton's 1996 immigration law was a political maneuver meant to double down on the policies of his Republican predecessors, and which led to the deportation of Salvadorian youth who exported gang culture to El Salvador. And this, folks, is part of the legacies of the Salvadorian Civil War. This is a picture in the post-war period of the exhumation of a child, from the town of El Mozote, and it perhaps took the end of the war for people to believe that this had actually taken place, and for Argentinian forensic teams to come to El Salvador to conduct these exhumations of mass graves in the country. Now, by 2006, the exploitive practices of US corporations operating under Bush's CAFTA led to the deepening of poverty in the country, where sweatshop workers make $250 a month and US companies operate tax-free. In the meantime, Salvadorian presidents belonging to the ultra-right-wing Nationalist Republican Alliance, founded by coffee oligarchs and death squad supporters during the Civil War, rolled out a whole set of economic policies. This is the post-war period, such as adopting the US dollar as the official currency of El Salvador in order to facilitate these companies' financial operations and the enrichment of venture capitalists like themselves. I know folks who are aware that the US dollar is the official currency in El Salvador today. Now, last year, the labor of Salvadorian workers produced in the so-called free trade zones what amounted to $2.1 billion in apparel alone, meant for US retail shops. And in 2019, and in response to the crisis of gangs and poverty, this guy right here, Nayib Bukele, a millennial dictator, adept at the use of social media, especially Twitter, was elected as the 43rd and current president of El Salvador. Since then, Bukele has consolidated an autocratic regime by eroding checks and balances, by changing the Salvadorian constitution to allow himself to remain in power, has also suspended constitutional rights of Salvadorians and common people in the name of quote unquote law and order. And his so-called state of exception has led to the mass incarceration of 2.5% of the adult population in El Salvador. Under his rule, this guy, the Salvadorian state has built the world's largest mega prison, capable of holding 70,000 inmates, folks. That's over 12 times larger than the biggest prison in the United States. All the while, Bukele's regime has deployed Pegasus, a military-grade spyware developed by Israel, with whom Bukele has strong ties, to spy on human rights activists and free-thinking journalists, while he utilizes the national treasure as his private investment account, making nebulous and financially unsound Bitcoin trades, the cryptocurrency which is now legal tender in El Salvador. This state of affairs is only bound to increase migration to El Salvador for more time. The Salvadorian Civil War and its legacies that I talked about here, and this history that I tried to sketch, are both products of 100 years of US interventionism in Central America, and the principal reason why Salvadorians, like Javier Zamora's parents, members of my family, and myself came to the United States, as have hundreds of thousands of other Salvadorians since. These are also the main reasons why the children of these immigrants, like myself and Zamora, seek to reunite with their parents. Before the Salvadorian Civil War, folks, there was less than 90,000 Salvadorians in the United States. At the conclusion of that war in 92, nearly 1.3 million resided here, and today that population is over 2.5 million people, a 2,800% increase, as I stated at the outset of this talk. Yet many of these immigrants, especially children, are not reunited with their loved ones, but end up in US immigration and detention centers, which represent the fastest growing sector of the US prison industrial complex, and many of which are privatized and run by for-profit corporations. These folks are the roots of our contemporary humanitarian crisis. And my hope is that folks walk away today understanding that El Salvador is not a shithole, as Trump believes, but a country whose land and people are the source of incredible wealth for many in this country and abroad, and whose history, as you can glean from this, is inextricably American history. I am also hopeful that today's talk answers the question about why we are here and why it is important to know our history and who we are. Thank you. Folks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moreno Campos. Guys, I just want to give an extra special thanks. Let's hear it one more time for our guest speakers, Dr. Leisy Abrego, Dr. Raul Moreno Campos. My name is Anthony Gonzalez. On behalf of the DVC Puente team, I want to thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Special shout out to the Dreamers Alliance, in particular, Juan Huerta for his support with the technology, and shout out to Yvette and Teresita as well. Cycle 29 Puentistas, I want you to know that we do these events and we do this work for you to gain this knowledge and take it with you moving forward and to apply what you learned here to your lives, to the betterment of your own communities and your pathway forward. Shout out to all of our students who attended and who are watching on Zoom, Latin American Lit, I know you're there, English 122L and beyond, far beyond. Special thanks to the Puente team. Cristina Gomez, we can't do these events without your support. Brian Guerra, we absolutely appreciate your support as well. And to my co-coordinators, Maria Dorado, Brenda Gonzalez, and Patrick Leong, thank you as always. We'll have more events for you coming up, and for now, we gotta go. Adelante.